Good morning, guys. We are starting a new unit. We're starting the skeletal system. And so this unit will have 3 learning targets, just like the last unit had. And the first learning target is all about the actual bones that exist within the skeletal system. So we will learn names and a couple of additional features for some of the bones. Again, because we are learning this from home, we're approaching it a little bit differently than I have in years past. Typically, we have the bones in our hands and we learn a lot more about each bone than we do this year, but at least we will have an understanding of these different bones that exist in our skeletal system, and we'll continue kind of learning forward. LT2 is more about that histology aspect, so bone growth and development, microscopic anatomy of bone. And then LT3 is a little more clinical based. So we'll do a fun little project in LT3 to wrap up the unit. So you should have the notes packet in front of you that is labeled number 1 in the very large packet that I gave you before you left for NTI. And so LT1 starts with an introduction to the skeletal system. There are moments where you will have to label aspects of the bones in your notes packet. So I tried to be pretty inclusive here so that you don't have a separate labeling sheet. And so I will ask you at times to label specific components of bones. So just pay attention as we kind of go through. Let's start with arrangement. In the arrangement section, we're going to talk about the parts of the system and the functions of the skeletal system. So you have, as a developed, adolescent and adult, you have approximately 206 bones. Now, I say approximately because it really depends on your progression in development. You are born with many more bones than this, a little over 300. And they begin to fuse as you develop and create larger bones. So by the time you are a matured adult, you have 206 bones in our body. We are not going to learn all 206 bones, but you will learn most of those. And so if some of you are feeling like that's overwhelming, consider we have bilateral symmetry, which means what exists on the right side typically exists on the left side. So if you take that number and chop it in half, that's a starting point. We're also going to pull out a lot of the wrist and ankle bones this year. And good news, a rib is called a rib. Doesn't matter which one you're counting, and you have a bunch of them. They're all called ribs. So really that number whittles its way down pretty significantly. Additionally, in this system, we'll talk about joints, cartilage, which is at the end of bones, helping to produce sort of less painful at times and consistent motions in our joints. And then we have ligaments, which hold one bone to a neighboring bone. So all of these will be covered within the system. When you look at this diagram, this shows in color, this shows the 2 divisions of the skeletal system. So you have an axial system, which is composed of all the bones of the skull and spinal cord. So everything that you see over here in green is your axial skeletal system, creating a bit of an axis running through the middle of your body. And then you have an appendicular skeletal system. That's everything that you see in purple. Appendicular might sound like appendage, which is what it is meant to sound like. So we're talking about, you have something called girdles. You have 2 girdles, and then you have the limbs that are attached to those girdles. So one girdle here is your shoulder girdle, and the other girdle here is your pelvic girdle. So we'll look at these pectoral and pelvic girdles and then the bones that come out of them as well. In terms of functions, we've seen these before at the beginning of the year when we did our body systems presentations. But as a reminder, the skeletal system has many functions: support of the body, protection of soft internal organs, movement, based on the fact that muscles are attached to bones. So really, when you talk about movement, it is a combination of your musculoskeletal system. So both of these working together, muscles contract because they are attached to bone. They pull on the bone, and the bones move our bodies. Bones store minerals and fats, and they make components of our blood, as seen in this red blood cell, white blood cell scanning electron microscope image right here. So lots of different functions for the skeletal system. Now we're going to cover some of the appendicular bones, not all of them today, but some of them. And so you have a space to write, but then you also have diagrams, and this diagram exists in your notes. So at times I will tell you, label this as blah, 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 blah. So you'll need to make sure that you're labeling as well as copying the notes down. So let's start with our most superior girdle, the pectoral girdle. So the pectoral girdle, all the ads are coming in. The pectoral girdle is basically your shoulder. So there are a couple of bones that work to create your shoulder. One is your scapula. Now your scapula is something that you might call your shoulder blade. There is what I want for you to see. I know that you have this diagram right here. So label this bone where the arrow is pointing. This is your scapula. Label that as your scapula. I know that you do not have this diagram, but I want you to see that on the back of the scapula, there is this very large line. It's almost a horizontal line. And this is called the spine of the scapula. We learn that now because it helps identify some muscles in the muscular system unit next on the back of our shoulder. So scapula here, make sure that it's labeled in this diagram, and then know that there is a very large line on the back of the scapula. If we were in class holding it in our hand, that is a great indicator for whether you're looking at the anterior or posterior side of the scapula. Also in the pectoral girdle is your clavicle. So up here down here in the diagram, this should be labeled as your clavicle. These are also your clavicle bones. You're looking at anterior surface and posterior surface of your clavicle bone. You'll notice that one end is sort of looks like it's been chopped off. This end is going to connect or articulate with your sternum. And this end over here is going to connect or articulate with a little bump that exists on your scapula, seen right here. And that creates this joint that allows for the arm bone here, the humerus, to connect or to articulate. So here's what I just said. The clavicle has an attachment to the scapula on its lateral end. So right here, in your diagram, because this shows anatomical position with some other bones, you might label this right here. This is attaching to your sternum. This is the sternal end of the clavicle. And this one over here is attaching to your scapula. It's the scapular end of your clavicle. So make sure that you've labeled those two and you see what bones the clavicle is articulating or connecting to. We also want to talk about this socket that has now been created. So this is called the glenoid cavity. So make sure that you label over here in the diagram that this sort of indentation now where your humerus is going to fit, that has a name. It is called the glenoid cavity. It will hold the head of the humerus and create your shoulder. Let's take a look at these bones. Some lovely music. So you can see up here, your clavicle. It's not a straight bone. It has a little bit of curvature to it. And you can see it connecting to the sternum and then also making a connection to the scapula. Here's our scapula. If we look at just the scapula, look at that spine on the back and look at that socket, the glenoid cavity that has been created to hold the head of the humerus. In position, There you can see visible body is so cool. All right, so let's look at our next slide. So take a look at this X-ray. What do you notice? This is a clavicle that has been fractured. So this is a pretty significant clavicular fracture. And really, a person whose clavicle snaps, that destabilizes your entire shoulder. And so part of the process of healing is going to be to stabilize, to allow those bones to come back in alignment and let the natural healing process, which we'll talk about in LT2, take place. But if you break your clavicle, that is destabilizing your shoulder and it will kind of fall down. So it'll have to be lifted and secured while that clavicle heals. You can also see here the head of the humerus, and you can see this bone right here is the scapula. Okay, let's talk about that humerus. So move to the section in your notes that says upper limbs. You have a humerus bone, which autocorrect on your notes turned it into humerus like haha funny. So you might cross out the word as it is written in your notes and write it the correct anatomical way. Here is your humerus bone. This is the bone that is in your upper arm. It's a very long bone that extends from your shoulder all the way down to your elbow. And there are 3 regions that I want you to label on your humerus. So find the long bone that looks like this. And at the top, this is the head. So this needs to be labeled as the head. There are 2 necks on the humerus. There is something called an anatomical neck, which is very, very close to the head. So indicate on your diagram an anatomical neck right up here by the head, and then come down a little bit as it begins to narrow and indicate a surgical neck. Now, I always remember that because they are kind of in alphabetical order as they descend. A comes before S. So anatomical neck sits above surgical neck. And then the last thing that I want you to label is actually a bracketed region. So bracket this entire middle region right here that is skinny. This is called the shaft. And so when we talk about, this is an example of a bone that's called a long bone. Long bones have a couple of characteristics. A very long middle shaft is one of those characteristics. Typically, we learn these epicondyles and the trochlea down here. This year, we're not, because we're not holding the bones and seeing them articulate. So the humerus, if you follow the humerus all the way down to your elbow, so if you follow it distally, you'll find that it connects with the 2 bones in your lower arm, which are called the ulna and the radius. And really, this creates a bit of a hinge joint. And so if you hold your arm out and then kind of flex your bicep, if you try that right now, you'll notice that your elbow is operating like a door hinge. It really only has a limited range of motion. It cannot hinge backwards. It cannot really hinge side to side. It can only pull your lower arm towards your body and then release it. So flex and extend. This bottom of the humerus is what is connecting to this top of the ulna and the radius. So the last thing that I want you to do on this page is label the ulna and the radius. So you'll have to look in your diagram. If you look at one of the bones is going to be kind of fat and it has a bit of a curl on it. If you held it in person, it looks like a crescent wrench. And actually, if you turn it sideways, it makes the shape of a U, which is really helpful when we hold it in our hands to remember it as the ulna. So label this one as the ulna. It is larger at the elbow and then sort of tapers down here as you move towards where the hand will be. And then the other one next to it is going to be the radius. So the ulna has a U shape at its proximal end, and the radius is going to be the other one. Now, if you hold your hand out, so do this with me. I know you're taking notes, but do this with me. Put your hand out on the table, palm up. So we're in anatomical position. If our palm is to the ceiling, if you feel on the pinky side of your arm, that is your ulna. If you feel on the thumb side of your arm, that is your radius. So that last bullet in anatomical position, the radius is on the thumb side. That is helpful to know sort of in position. They're laying parallel to each other. Ulna is pinky side, radius is thumb side. But here's a cool thing about the ulna and the radius. When you rotate or pronate your hand, so basically if your hand is palm to the ceiling right now and you turn it palm to the ground, you have just rotated your radius over your ulna. They're the only two bones in our body that cross over when we pronate. And so here's a picture of what that looks like. Here is a quick little video to show you that movement. So it's pretty cool. You can see in anatomical position, they're parallel. And when you rotate, they twist over. And so that's a pretty cool thing. Again, only two bones in our body that really do that. Oop, nope, we're not going to start it again. Let's talk about the hand. We're going to end on the hand. I'm going to show you this quick little video about the regions of the hand. Now, keep in mind when they talk about all of these wrist bones, they're called carpal bones. We are not going to learn the individual names of these wrist bones this year, but I will tell you or show you, here are your radius right here. Radius is kind of thicker at the hand, and here's your ulnar. They connect with the carpals. So pay attention to kind of the arrangement here, and then we'll come back and label the things that we need to know.
The hand is made up of 27 bones, not including the sesamoid bones, or bones embedded in tendons. These 27 bones can be divided amongst three groups: the phalanges, the metacarpals, and the carpals. Let's start with the phalanges, which are the bones of your fingers. There are 14, and these can be divided into the distal, intermediate, and proximal phalanges. The distal ones are the most distant from your body's core, while the proximal ones are the closest to your palm. Your thumb is the only finger that lacks an intermediate phalanx bone, mirroring your big toe's structure. The points of contact between the phalanx bones of each finger are called the interphalangeal articulations of the hand. Articulation is just a fancy word for joint. 5 metacarpals run from the proximal phalanges to the carpal, or wrist bones. Where the metacarpals meet the proximal phalanges, you have the metacarpophalangeal joints. If you think that's a mouthful, just call them your knuckles. Now, let's look at the 8 carpals, which can be organized into 2 rows. The distal row, you guessed it, are more distant from your body's core and closer to the fingers. The bones in this row make contact with the metacarpals at the intercarpal articulations. The proximal row articulates the bones of the forearm. The proximal row includes the scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, and pisiform. The distal row includes the trapezium, the trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Here's a helpful mnemonic I found for the carpals. So long to pinky, here comes the thumb.
Okay, so again, we're not learning all of the names of the carpals this year, but we are going to learn these regions.
The hand is made up of 27 bones.
Excuse you. All right, so let's look at your next section. So we'll do the words first and then come back over here. This diagram shows pretty much everything that we need to label on the hand that's in your packet. So when it comes to the hand, we see the 3 regions that are broken down. Wrist bones are actually called carpal bones. The bones that exist in the palm of your hand are called metacarpals. And then your fingers are called phalanges. Now you'll notice here Next to metacarpals and phalanges, I have numbers. So this diagram has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In most diagrams, actually, it's Roman numerals 1 through 5. But this is a way, since a metacarpal is just called a metacarpal, we have to distinguish which metacarpal we're talking about. And so they're numbered. And the numbers always start from the thumb and move towards the pinky. So this one right here that my arrow is on would be metacarpal number 3. Up here, this would be a phalange or a part of a phalange or finger, still number 3. So make sure when you are asked to identify on the hand that you are giving all parts of the answer. So if that's a metacarpal, it needs to say metacarpal and the number. If it's a phalange, it needs to say the number, but then it also needs to say which part of the phalange. So your finger, if you take your finger and hold it out in front of you and sort of wiggle it back and forth, there are 3 sections to our 4 fingers. Now our 5th finger, our thumb, only has 2 sections. We'll come back to that in a second. So if I look at just the standard finger and it's 3 sections, there's 3 bones that make up the joints that allow for my finger to move the way that it does. There is a proximal phalange. There is a middle or medial phalange. Your video called it an intermedial, but I've actually never seen that before. And we're going to stick with medial or middle. And then there is a distal, which is the tip of your finger. So if I ask you to identify, for example, where the arrow is right now on the hand, you would have to tell me that is the 1, 2, 3, third medial or middle phalange. So there's a lot to answering for a finger to get full credit. Okay, so take a second right now. Your hand doesn't have anything on it. So what I want you to do is box out this wrist zone and label it as carpals. You don't have to learn, you don't have to write all these different names. I don't need all of those this year, but I do need this region boxed out as carpals. I need the next region boxed out on your notes as metacarpals, 1 through 5. And then I need the last region boxed out as phalanges, proximal, medial, and distal. Now on a diagram, here's where students get messed up. They forget that the metacarpal region of our hand is actually covered in flesh. It looks like it's part of the finger. So if I ask you, what is this bone right here? Your inclination might be, oh, that's a part of my finger. So that's a phalange. But actually, all of this space right here where the metacarpals exist are covered in flesh, solid flesh. So that's the palm of your hand. If you look at your hand, that makes up the palm. And so be careful on the diagrams when you're labeling that you don't label a metacarpal as a phalange, thinking, oh, it looks like a part of my finger. It's actually a part of your palm. The last thing that we'll look at here, and this still goes in the hand section, is the idea that your thumb, so here's our thumb, right? Look, take a look at this finger. I know you're probably writing the words down, but take a look at this finger. Here's our wrist bones, here's our palm, and then here are our phalanges. Well, notice that your thumb is missing that middle phalange. And so your thumb actually only has 2 sections, 2 regions, and we just use the words proximal and distal for the 2 bones in the thumb. And new word for the thumb, the thumb can also be called the pollux, Pollux, the pollux. So keep that in mind. We'll see a similar-ish name for the big toe because it is similar in structure as well. All right, so we are going to pause right here. And before the video is over, let me tell you, we've just finished learning about the hand. And so the very next document in your big packet that you picked up is called the aging hand. It is labeled as number 2 in terms of document numbers. And that is the activity that you will need to have done by the next time that we see each other on Thursday. So you've taken this lecture today during class time. You need to either Tuesday or Wednesday, you need to do the aging hand and have it done by the time that you come to class on Thursday. We're going to do some stuff with it. Don't be surprised if I ask you to turn your camera on at the beginning of class on Thursday and hold that completed document up to the camera so that I can verify that you have completed it. Okay, this is long enough. Have a great day. I will see you all on Thursday.